So my PowerPoint about the two ESL classroom observations that I did, one was in a grammar classroom and one was in a writing classroom at Madonna University. So the first observation that I looked at was in the combination class for the pre-advanced, high, and low intermediate academic grammar. There were 16 students in the class. The majority of them were young adults, although one was middle-aged. It was a range of English proficiency levels. The majority were low to high intermediate, but there were a few that were pre-advanced. It was a pretty diverse group. So we had French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Polish, Arabic, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese native speakers. And in the class arrangement, there were 4 rows that had 10 seats in each row. All of those faced the teacher and the whiteboard. So this first lesson was on verb tenses. So the kind of breakdown of the time spent during each class um, for each area. So obviously a lot of it wasn't grammar, about 30 minutes. Then there was some pronunciation where they were really kind of working for how do we say these words, how are like the Y pronounced and like stymied, and things like that. And then the other stuff was like speaking, vocabulary, reading, writing, and listening, which was pretty much equally kind of allotted about 10 minutes each. The students kind of had working out of a task book, and they had like read over the lesson, and then they talked about the lesson, and then they listened to the teacher talk about the lesson, and then they wrote a few things down, and they stressed the vocabulary. One of the things I really enjoyed that he did was he spent some time talking about years, like why we pronounce things like 2021, but we say like 1970, but we say the year 2000 or 2008. And I think even as a native speaker, it was interesting to kind of see that and how it was put into context. So the class interaction breakdown, a lot of it was individual. There was about 20 minutes working individually, 15 minutes kind of presenting individually, but there was also quite a bit of time doing pair work. And I think that's really where this class shined. The ability for the students to kind of work together, talk to each other in their L1, sometimes in English, but just kind of working through these ideas to make sure that they were thinking it through correctly. There was a small amount of whole group instruction, not very much, about 15 minutes. And then there was a lot of kind of question answer time, almost like choral responses at some places. Other places it was just like one-on-one responses. And that took about 20 minutes. So most of the instruction materials used in this grammar class were the textbook. There was like a worksheet. There was really no technology. There was like an issue with some of the students not having the correct textbook, which is I think why he made the worksheets, because there was like a problem in the actual version that was put into the textbook butler. So the worksheets weren't really in addition to, they were more in lieu of people who didn't have the correct textbook. So what I decided was this was kind of more content-based instruction, because this teacher was really guiding the student learning. They were supporting the students by having them pay attention to how language is being used to deliver content and kind of scaffolding that language, talking about present and future and when does it exist, is it still existing. Also, there was a lot of collaborative work where the students were really trying to understand the language they were studying. And lastly, the students were given the benefit of being corrected by the teacher, so they immediately knew if they had the correct form and they could make that change in their own workbook. Also, the two students were given some time to self correct to make sure that they understood what was actually the correct version. It wasn't like trial and error, they knew immediately if they had it correct or not. So the standards that I really kind of focused on here was that the teacher was definitely aware of the verb tenses, not only his own knowledge of that, but how to kind of share that with the students, making sure that they understood the difference in why certain verbs were present perfect or past or future. Even as a native speaker, I felt like I actually benefited from that lesson as well. In addition, I think that he really did stress how to kind of use that language and making sure that the students were aware, like when they were reading these passages and filling in the blank with the correct word, they really had a good idea of how to defend their choice, which I think that was pretty impressive, especially considering the wide variety of students' levels of English language in this class. So quite a bit of stuff that I saw in the SIOP model. So there were definitely links explicitly made between past learning and new concepts. It was something that was talked about at the very beginning of class. The teacher drew a model on the board to kind of show them that, kind of putting like lines on it so they knew when things were happening. And the teacher also made reference back to that model on the board when the students were asking questions or double checking which tense of the verb they should use. The other thing I noticed was there's a lot of comprehensible input. The speech was appropriate for the student's proficiency level. Words that were maybe even a little bit challenging within the passages in the text, the teacher took the time to explain that word and explain what that meant. So the kids were actually benefiting from that. The idea of when do we use one word versus another and kind of like clarifying those differences, I thought was a great a lesson there. Also, there was a clear explanation of the task. The students knew that they were working in this section, reading over page 42, answering the questions there. They were going to have a certain amount of time to do it. They were going to be sharing that out, and they would have the right information. They knew when they were working together. They knew when they were working alone. So very clear explanation. And then a variety of techniques were used. Like I mentioned, there was the modeling on the board. There was the actual referring back to earlier lessons. There was referring back to the idea of when we use certain things in the English language. Also, for interaction, there was frequent opportunities for interaction. That's between the teacher and the student, among students, and that really pushed that lesson to go a little bit further than it probably would went otherwise. The students were able to kind of clarify their understanding. The teacher was able to kind of ask for a little bit more and deepen their own understanding. Also, I think the grouping configurations really supported the lesson. And there was time where the students actually did have a chance to speak in their L1. Even though there was a diverse group of language students, like L1 language speakers in the class, there seemed to be at least a few that were close. And those students did kind of pair up together and work through some things. For observation number 2, this was a writing class. And so what I noticed here was that there were about 15 students, so it was the same group of students. Many of those looked familiar. I think one person was just absent. So once again, the majority were young adults. One was, again, a middle-aged nun. The English language proficiency, same thing. They were low intermediate to high intermediate with a few pre-advanced. It was the same students' first languages. French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Polish, Arabic, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese. And the tables were arranged exactly the same way. Oh, so my observation one reflection looks like there's one slide off, but I really did enjoy how the professor spent time at the beginning of class really getting to know the students at a personal level, making a lot of discussion about the soccer team. A lot of the students in the class were actually on the soccer team and talking about their class, talking about their COVID testing, talking about how well they were, sharing some successes. One of the students' picture was in there as like kind of like the top scorer, or he did something really good, and they were sharing that. So the class felt really warm and welcoming. I also thought that the students benefited from the time that they did work with a peer. And I enjoyed how the students and the teacher had like an inside joke. So whenever something seemed to be like an exception to the rule, like, why would this happen? And like the whole class would kind of chime in, because English. And I thought that was really cute. It seemed like that had been going on for a while, and I really enjoyed that. All right. So back to my observation number 2, which was in the writing class. So this content lesson was geared for writing a narrative paragraph. So in there, they really did spend quite a bit of time on writing, which makes sense. So about 40 minutes. There was also a lot of reading. So reading passages on the PowerPoint slideshow, reading passages in the textbook, reading each other's work, like peer editing. There was also quite a bit of listening as the teacher presented the slides. A little bit with grammar, a little bit of vocabulary where students were kind of checking, like, was this a good word to use? And the teacher kind of providing another word if they needed it. And then some speaking where the students were sharing out what their topic sentence was, what were some things that they had, like a story they were telling. There was a lot of focus on like connecting this back to something that was important to the students, sharing like a story, right? Because we're writing a narrative paragraph. And so that story had to be entertaining and it had to kind of bring the reader in. And so the teacher spent quite a bit of time working with the students one on one and in a whole class setting to really kind of get them to put their own take on that. So the breakdown of the class was a little bit different than the first class I observed. So here students were working individually about 50 minutes at a time. So I was there for almost 2 hours. So about half of that, the students were working individually, either working on their own or presenting to the teacher or to their partner. They did work in pairs for a little bit. That's during the peer editing time, so about 15 minutes. There was a little bit more whole group instruction here because there was a lot of build up to like what are the steps involved in writing a topic sentence, how do we set up a narrative paragraph, how to kind of structure the lesson. So there was like a free write to begin just to do some brainstorming. There was a lot of modeling on behalf of the teacher on the board to kind of show them what she expected. There were handouts that really were nicely laid out that kind of helped the kids kind of structure the topics they were doing. First the free write, then ordering the sequence of events, then doing their first draft, then doing the peer editing, and then having the time to go back and reflect, write that final copy for the next class to turn in. There were a lot of student teacher question answers, a little bit different format the other class. This was more one-on-one, where the teacher went around to every student in the class and asked them questions about their writing when they got to the point where they were finishing up with their topic sentence and the beginning of how to structure their narrative paragraph. So it was more of a one-on-one thing just to make sure that the students were on the right path. And I thought that was a really great strategy, really helped the students maybe get a clarifying question, making sure they felt good before they kept writing. So we did have textbooks still used again. The worksheets here were really good. I felt like they really did a good job of helping the students kind of see what they were doing. And the teacher was also kind of keeping that work organized because she was going to be collecting those worksheets back to kind of see the students' process in writing. The PowerPoint slideshow was also very nicely done. There were a lot of like bolded words, highlighted stuff. The slides didn't have too many things on it. I felt it was like written at an appropriate level where it really got to the content, but wasn't overwhelming. So the students really could access that material. There were places where the teacher had directed them to take a few notes. Even those notes were not excessive. They were clean and neat, step by step, numbered. So I felt like the teacher did a lot of background preparation for the lesson to really make sure that the students could access it. So I decided that this was a task-based learning language teaching focus, the TBLT, because there was a pre-test phase that really began this task sequence. And the teacher introduced the language to like, those transitional words that we see in stories so that we know when there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Spending a lot of time kind of going through it with the kids so they knew kind of how they might put those words into their own paragraph. Also, the students were actively engaged with the task. The teacher was still monitoring the performance and intervening when necessary. They were not left on their own. And I think that was really a nice thing where the kids knew that they could just get a little help if they needed it. The teacher also constantly evaluated the students in light of task outcomes. Did you get your free write done? How does your topic sentence look? Do you have those things put in order? How did we get our first draft in there? Did you turn your peer editing thing to your partner? Did everybody exchange papers? There was a lot of just check where they're at. Making sure that the students were writing things, that if they didn't understand something, to ask their partner what they were writing. And then at the end, making sure they were turning in the right material. So the standards here I really wanted to focus on was the planning, implementing, instruction, because I really feel like this professor did a great job with that. The stuff that they picked was definitely evidence-based, student-centered. It was relevant. It was tied to what they were doing. There was good modeling and showing, like the teacher went through and modeled their own experience, like skydiving. And as they're doing it in different colors on the whiteboard to really show the students that they could go back and add details, kind of pushing those adjective use in there so it didn't seem so like dry and it seemed more of an entertaining story. So those were the things I wanted to focus on. So the SIOP model here had some things similar to the first observation. They were definitely explicitly linking the concepts together to background experience. Past in learning and new concepts we talked about, the idea of a topic sentence in a regular paragraph versus this narrative paragraph, the idea of how we actually want to make sure that our first sentence here is not the topic sentence, it's usually some background information. So kind of clarifying that. The key vocabulary being emphasized, like I said, highlighted in the PowerPoints, repeated, kind of shown over and over again. Looking at a passage from somebody else's narrative paragraph where all those transitional words were highlighted, I thought was a very helpful trip as well. The other thing is it had the students had ample time to really use these learning strategies. And the scaffolding was amazing. Like I said, the teacher showing her thinking, talking through her thinking, modeling her thinking on the board, I think was the highlight of the class. Interaction, there was frequent opportunities for student and teacher to talk to each other. The teacher, like I said, made a point to go around to every single student in the class to check where they were at. And then the grouping configurations, I think, supported the language, where they had a chance to peer edit, which is important so they could see some of their own things they're doing and get an idea what other people are doing. So my observation reflections for this one, I really was impressed with the scaffolding that the professor did, orally and on the worksheets. I think that the professor spent a lot of time modeling their own thinking process throughout the whole class instruction. I think that was really a benefit to the students. The use of highlighting keywords and phrases on the PowerPoint was helpful. Even highlighting keywords on their own sample paragraph. Also, I really enjoyed the fact that they did the peer editing. Being able to see someone else's writing, and looking at the positives and looking at the strengths and also asking questions. If they really didn't understand what somebody was saying, that's a pretty good sign that maybe they need to do some stuff to change it, or maybe it's just a language thing. I did notice one student who had a translator out to kind of help him with some of the words. And, he probably was a little bit lower level student, but he was definitely working through it and using strategies to help get him at that same level. I thought that was great. So my references, I did use a textbook. I looked up some information on the SIOP model, and then I used the TESOL standards that were put into our reading from a few weeks ago. So I really did enjoy this opportunity, and I felt like it helped me kind of see what this might look like in a college setting. I was kind of surprised at how many different levels were in the class at the college setting, and also kind of surprised that the students were similar, like the same students. I kind of wondered what their classes must look like if two of their classes were basically with the same group of people on the English language. So that was kind of an interesting thing for me. I guess Madonna has some structure into their TESOL program with the students where until they kind of test out of it, they do get a lot of extra support. I was just curious what other classes they were taking in addition, because when I talked to the professors, it sounded like they were taking both of these classes and a culture class. And then I was wondering, do they only have one other class? But it was still an interesting experience, and I'm glad I got to do it. I hope you enjoyed this.